My phone lit up at 2:07 in the morning. I was already awake. I hadn't been sleeping well since October, and old habits from 22 years of investigative work don't disappear just because you retire. I looked at the screen. Natalie. I picked up before the second ring. She said 5 words. Derek won't take me. Dad. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't ask what happened, or why, or what Derek had said. After 2 decades of reading situations for a living, you learn that some sentences contain everything you need. Those 5 words were enough. I said, I'm coming. And I was already reaching for my keys. The drive to her house on Claremont Street takes 11 minutes at that hour. I know because I've made it before twice when she was in her 20s and called me from that neighborhood before she even owned the house. And once last spring when she thought she smelled gas. 11 minutes. I was there in 10. The porch light was on. Natalie was standing inside the glass storm door with her coat on and her hospital bag at her feet. One hand pressed flat against the side of her stomach. She was 38 weeks along. She had been 38 weeks along for 6 years. In a way, 6 years of appointments and procedures and paperwork and hope that kept getting deferred until finally, 8 months ago, it wasn't. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Her OB had used the phrase closely monitored more than once. This was not a night to be standing alone in a doorway at 2 a.m. Derek was not in the doorway. Derek was upstairs. The bedroom light was off. I carried her bag to the car. I helped her into the passenger seat. I did not go upstairs. I did not knock on the door or leave a note or send a message. I pulled out of the driveway and headed toward St. Augustine Medical Center, and I kept both hands on the wheel. We were about 4 minutes out when she told me what he'd said. She wasn't crying. Natalie has always been more controlled than people expect, which is something she got from her mother, but her voice had a flatness to it that I recognized. It's the sound a person makes when something has confirmed what they'd been afraid to believe. He said he needed his sleep, she told me. He said I was 12 minutes from the hospital. He said to call an Uber. I kept my eyes on the road. I didn't respond right away. I've learned from years of sitting across from people who were lying, or people who were telling the truth and didn't know how to say it, that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. But Natalie didn't say anything else. She just looked out the passenger window at the dark street, and I drove. I thought about the first time she brought Derek to the house. She had been so certain of him, that particular certainty she gets when she's decided something is right. She'd put her hand on his arm and said, "He seems like a man who planned ahead. Dad." She'd been smiling when she said it. I had shaken his hand and thought, she's probably right. He had a firm grip, and he asked about my work with the right kind of interest, not too much, not too little. He seemed steady. I'd spent 22 years reading people, and I thought he seemed steady. I had been giving Derek Marsh the benefit of the doubt ever since that afternoon. That drive to St. Augustine at 2:07 in the morning was the night I stopped. Let me tell you how long I had been giving it. Natalie was 32 when she and Derek got married. And she was 32 when she first told me she wanted children. She said it the way she says most things she's decided quietly, without fanfare, as if the decision had already been made, and she was simply informing me of a fact. We were sitting on my back porch, the summer after the wedding, and she had a glass of iced tea she wasn't drinking. She said, "Derek and I have been talking about starting a family." I told her that was wonderful. I meant it. What came next was not wonderful. It was 6 years of appointments and blood work and medications that made her tired in ways she couldn't explain. 6 years of hope that arrived on a schedule and left on a schedule. 2 rounds of IVF that failed the first at week 8. The second never implanted at all. She didn't call me after the second one. I found out 3 days later when I stopped by with groceries, and she answered the door still in her teaching clothes at 7 in the evening, which meant she hadn't sat down since she got home. I put the groceries away. I didn't ask questions. Sometimes that's the only thing a father can do that's worth anything. Derek, during those years, said the right things. That much I'll give him. He talked about the treatments as a shared project, used words like "we" and "our timeline," and "when it works." He was the one who researched the fertility clinic. They eventually switched to the one with the higher success rates, and he drove Natalie to the intake appointment because she was too anxious to drive herself. She told me a lot of things about Derek in those years that I filed away in the part of my memory I'd used for 22 years as an investigator, the part that stores details without drawing conclusions yet. He worked long hours at the logistics firm, came home tired, talked about his department's quarterly targets the way men talk about things that exhaust them but also define them. I understood that. I'd been that man once. I thought he was carrying his share. When the third round of IVF succeeded, Natalie called me from the clinic parking lot. She was crying and laughing at the same time, and I could hear Derek's voice in the background saying something I couldn't make out. I sat down at my kitchen table and stayed there for a while after we hung up. I counted the rings on the wood from where coffee mugs had been set without coasters over the years. There were 11. I thought about her mother, who would have driven straight to that parking lot without hanging up the phone first. Then I got up and drove over with flowers, which was insufficient and also the best I could do. The pregnancy was classified high risk from the beginning. Natalie was 38. She had the history. Dr. Holt, her OB, a woman I would come to have a great deal of respect for, was thorough and direct in the way I've always preferred. She laid out the monitoring schedule, the warning signs, the plan. Natalie listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap, the way she used to sit in church when she was small and was trying very hard to pay attention. Derek was in that appointment. He asked 2 questions, both of them reasonable. I thought, again, that he was carrying his share. The first thing I noticed was the 7th-month appointment. Natalie mentioned it the week before that Dr. Holt wanted to do an additional ultrasound, a more detailed one, because there had been a question at the previous visit about placental positioning. It wasn't an emergency, it was precautionary, but it was also the kind of appointment that a husband attends. And when the day came, and Derek didn't, Natalie's explanation was already prepared. She called me that evening and said he had a meeting, he couldn't move. It was a client presentation. She said it the way she says things she's already argued with herself about. I said, "How did the appointment go?" She said, "Dr. Holt was satisfied with what she saw." I said, "Good." I didn't say anything about Derek. I didn't have enough yet. But I noted it. 22 years of reading people and situations had given me a particular habit I don't conclude. I accumulate. A single absence is a meeting. A pattern is something else. I wasn't sure yet which one this was. 3 weeks before her due date, Natalie came over for Sunday dinner. She looked tired in the specific way of late pregnancy, a tiredness that sits in the eyes and doesn't lift. We ate and she talked about her students, a boy in her class who'd started reading chapter books on his own, the way she always talked about her students, with that particular warmth that made me certain she would be a good mother. After dinner, she mentioned, "The way you mentioned something you've already decided isn't worth mentioning, that Derek had ordered the infant car seat and then returned it. He'd said it was more than they needed to spend right now, that he could borrow one from someone at work." She said it without looking at me. I said, "Is that settled?" Then she said it was fine. I looked at her hands on the table. She was turning her wedding ring, the way she turns things when she's not quite finished thinking about them. I didn't say anything. I went to the baby supply store the following Tuesday and bought the car seat myself. I told Natalie it was a gift. She didn't argue. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 9 days before her due date. She sounded careful on the phone the way people sound when they're relaying information they're not sure how to characterize. She said Derek had come home tired from work and had a presentation first thing in the morning, an important one, and he'd asked her to let him sleep. She said he'd said, and here she paused, the way she pauses when she's quoting someone exactly, "I need my sleep tonight. Nat, don't wake me unless it's really urgent." I was quiet for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, the neighbor's porch light was on, and I could see the outline of the oak tree at the edge of the yard, the one that had been there since before we moved into this house 31 years ago. I said, "What do you think counts as really urgent?" She didn't answer right away. I waited. I've learned that the pauses are where the truth lives in my old work, and in most conversations worth having. She said, "Finally, I don't know, Dad, he's just tired." I said, "I know." Then I said, "You have my number." She said she knew. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, the boy in her class, whether the oak tree in my yard had lost a branch in last week's wind, and then she said goodnight. I sat at the kitchen table after we hung up. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I thought about the 7th-month appointment, and the car seat, and the way she'd turned her ring at the dinner table, and the specific pause before she'd repeated his words back to me. I thought about what I knew, and what I was still accumulating. I thought about what really urgent means to a man who is tired, and what it means to a woman 9 days from her due date who has spent 6 years trying to get there. I went to bed at 10. My phone was on the nightstand. At 2:07 in the morning, it rang. Owen Ray Marsh was born at 5:43 in the morning in Operating Room 2 on the 3rd floor of St. Aurelius Medical Center by emergency cesarean section. I know the exact time because I wrote it in the small notebook I carry in my left breast pocket, a habit from 31 years of field work that I have never been able to break. I was sitting in a plastic chair in the corridor outside the surgical suite when Dr. Margaret Holt came through the double doors and pulled down her mask. She looked at me first. Then she looked past me, down the empty hallway in both directions. Then she looked back at me. "Where's the baby's father?" she asked. I said, "He wasn't able to make it." Dr. Holt is not a woman who wastes expressions. She has the particular stillness of someone who has delivered several thousand human beings into the world and has long since stopped being surprised by the things families do. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Mom and baby are both stable." She did very well. She shook my hand and went back through the doors. I had called Derek 11 times between 2:09 and 4:30 in the morning. The first 3 calls rang through to voicemail. The next 4 went directly after the 7th. I stopped leaving messages and simply called again. On the 11th attempt, at 4:31, the call connected for 2 seconds and then ended. I noted the time in the notebook. His first text arrived at 9:47 in the morning. How did it go? 3 words. No punctuation. I was sitting beside Natalie's bed when her phone lit up with it. She was still groggy from the anesthesia, her hair damp at the temples, one hand resting on the edge of the bassinet where Owen slept in a thin cotton hat. She read the message. She set the phone face down on the blanket. She didn't say anything. And I didn't ask. I looked at the timestamp, 9:47, and I thought about what had ended at 9:30 that morning. Derek's quarterly presentation, the one he'd mentioned at dinner 3 weeks earlier, the one he'd described as non-negotiable. I wrote 9:47 in the notebook. Below it, I wrote presentation ends 9:30. The gap between those 2 numbers was 17 minutes. That was how long it had taken him, after finishing, to wonder how it had gone. Natalie called him that afternoon. I stepped into the hallway to give her privacy, but the room was small and the door didn't close fully. I heard her voice steady, careful, the voice she uses when she is managing something rather than feeling it. I heard her say Owen's name. I heard her say the word cesarean. I did not hear her cry. When I came back in, she was looking at the window. She said Derek had a dinner thing. She said it the way you say something you've already decided not to examine too closely. I nodded. I sat down. I asked if she wanted me to bring anything from the house tomorrow. She said her blue cardigan, the one in the second drawer, and her own shampoo. On the second day, his text read, "Mom says she can stop by if you need anything." Not "I'll stop by." Not "I'm coming." His mother. Offered as a proxy, the way you send a card when you can't attend a funeral. Natalie showed me the message without comment. I read it and handed the phone back. She typed a reply I didn't see what she wrote and set the phone on the tray table. Adrian came in around 11 to check Natalie's vitals. She was efficient and quiet, the way nurses are when they've learned that unnecessary conversation in a recovery room costs something. She was adjusting the IV line when she said, almost as an aside, "Someone called the floor this morning asking about estimated discharge for this room." She said it without looking up from the line. I said, "What time?" "Around 8:15. She made a note in the chart. They didn't ask about her condition, just when she'd be ready to go home." I said, "Do you have a log of the call?" She looked up then. She had been a day shift nurse for long enough to understand why someone would ask that question, and she did not seem surprised by it. She said she would check. She came back 7 minutes later with a printed call record from the floor desk. She set it on the rolling table beside my chair without comment. The name in the caller field was D. Marsh. The time was 8:17 a.m. Natalie was looking at the window. I don't think she heard the exchange. I folded the call record once and put it in my breast pocket next to the notebook. Then she asked me to read to Owen from the book she'd brought in her hospital bag. It was a picture book about a bear who goes to sleep in autumn and wakes up to find the world changed. She had bought it 7 months ago at a shop 2 blocks from the fertility clinic on the day they confirmed the heartbeat. I read it twice. Owen slept through both readings. Natalie watched him the entire time. Connie Marsh arrived on the 3rd day with a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in cellophane and a smile that had clearly been prepared in advance. She is a woman who fills silence with words the way some people fill holes with concrete quickly, thoroughly, and with the apparent belief that the structural problem has now been solved. She kissed Natalie on the cheek and held Owen for 4 minutes and said he had Derek's nose, which may or may not have been true and was certainly not the point. Then she looked at me across the bassinet and said, "Derek is so busy right now. You know how it is. He sends his love." I said, "I know how it is." She smiled. I smiled. We understood each other exactly. I stayed until visiting hours ended. On the drive home, I stopped at the house to pick up Natalie's cardigan and shampoo and a few other things she'd asked for. I let myself in with the spare key she'd given me 2 years ago when Derek had started traveling for work. The house was quiet. The kitchen was clean in the way that means no one has cooked in it recently. I went upstairs to get the cardigan from the second drawer, and I passed the door to the master bedroom. It was open. The bed was made, Natalie's side turned down slightly at the corner, the way she always leaves it. Derek's side flat and smooth and undisturbed. The pillow had the shallow impression of a head that had slept there through the night and gotten up unhurried. He had gone back to sleep after they left. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I got the cardigan and went back downstairs. Sylvia Okafor came to the hospital on the 4th day. She is 71 years old, a retired obstetric nurse who spent 28 years at County General before her knees made the long shifts untenable. And she has lived 3 houses down from Natalie for the past 9 years. It was Sylvia who had driven Natalie to the hospital. At 2 in the morning, Natalie had called her first, from habit, because Sylvia was the person she called when something went wrong, and she needed someone competent and calm. That fact alone told me something I had already suspected about the texture of Natalie's daily life. Sylvia brought soup in a thermos and a crossword book and sat with Natalie for an hour while I took a walk. When I came back, Natalie had fallen asleep with Owen on her chest, and Sylvia was sitting in the chair beside the window, working on the crossword with a pencil. She looked up when I came in. She said, quietly, "Can I talk to you in the hall for a minute?" We stood in the corridor outside. The floor was the particular beige of every hospital I have ever been in, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency you stop hearing after the first hour and start hearing again after the 4th day. Sylvia held the crossword book against her chest and looked at me the way a woman looks at a man when she has decided to say something she has been holding for several days. She said, "The morning I picked Natalie up when she called me at 2, I got there about 15 minutes after she called. Derek answered the door. He was in his robe. He let me in and went back upstairs." She paused. "I was helping Natalie with her bag in the entryway, and I could hear him on the phone, in the bedroom. The door wasn't fully closed." I waited. He was talking to someone, I don't know who, but I heard him say, She looked down at the crossword book, then back at me. He said, "No, I'm not going. She's fine. I'll go when it's over." The hallway was very quiet. I said, "You're sure of that?" "I've been a nurse for 28 years, Sylvia said. "I know how to listen to what's being said in a room when someone thinks no one is listening. I heard it clearly." She looked at me steadily. "I thought you should know." I thanked her. She went back inside. I stood in the corridor for another minute, looking at nothing in particular, and wrote the words in the notebook. "She's fine. I'll go when it's over." Then I put the notebook back in my pocket and went in to sit with my daughter and my grandson. On the 5th day, Derek called. Natalie was awake, sitting up, Owen in the crook of her arm. She answered on the second ring. I was in the chair beside the bed, and I did not move. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds, I know, because I watched the timer on her phone screen, which she had set on the tray table between us. I could hear his voice through the speaker, not clearly enough to catch every word, but clearly enough to hear the rhythm of it. Confident, unhurried, the voice of a man who believes the situation is basically under control. He said he'd been meaning to call. He said it had been a crazy week. He said he was thinking he'd come by this weekend, maybe Saturday, if things settled down at work. He asked if she needed anything. He said Owen sounded great from the pictures. He said she looked good, too, in the picture Connie had sent him. He had not come to the hospital. He had received pictures from his mother. Natalie said, "Okay," she said. "Sure," she said. "We'll see you Saturday then." Her voice was the same careful, managed voice I had heard on the second day. She said goodbye and set the phone down and looked at Owen. I had been counting. In 4 minutes and 12 seconds, Derek Marsh said the word "I" 17 times. I had written a tick mark in the notebook for each one. 17 marks. Not once in those 4 minutes did he ask about the incision. Not once did he ask how the surgery had gone. Not once did he ask what the doctor had said, or whether she was sleeping, or whether she was in pain. 17 times the word "I," 0 times the word "hurt" or "healing" or "how are you really." I looked at my daughter looking at her son. She was running one finger very lightly along the edge of Owen's ear, the way she used to touch the silk edge of her childhood blanket when she was small and needed to feel that something was real. I had not seen her do that in 30 years. I closed the notebook. I put it back in my pocket. I had what I needed for now, and I had 48 hours before the weekend. The 6th day was a Thursday. Derek arrived at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I had been sitting in the chair by the window since morning, and the wall clock in Natalie's room had a second hand that stuttered slightly on the 40-second mark of every minute. I had been watching it stutter for 6 hours. When the door opened and Derek walked in, I noted the time the same way I used to note arrival times in my field log, not because I planned to do anything with the information immediately, but because the habit of recording had kept me alive in situations where I hadn't known in advance what would matter. He was wearing a blue Oxford shirt, pressed, dark slacks. He had shaved. In 22 years of knowing this man from the first Sunday dinner where Natalie had introduced him as someone from work, to every holiday and birthday and crisis in between, I had never seen him look more like a photograph of himself than he did walking through that hospital room door on the 6th day. He went to Natalie first. He leaned down and kissed her forehead and said, "God, I've missed you." He said it the way a person says a line they have practiced not without feeling, but with the feeling arriving slightly after the words, like an echo. Natalie reached up and touched his face. She was still on pain medication. Her eyes were soft in a way that made something tighten in my chest. Then he picked up Owen. He held the baby, the way men hold babies when they want to be seen, holding a baby arm slightly extended. The child turned outward toward an imaginary audience. Owen was 11 days old and had no opinion about any of this. He blinked once and made the small sound he made when he was deciding whether to sleep. Derek looked at the nurse who had come in to check the IV line. Her name was Adrienne. She had been on the day shift since Tuesday and had shown Natalie twice how to adjust Owen's swaddle. Derek said, "Hey, Would you mind taking a photo just this moment? You know." He smiled. It was a good smile. I had always acknowledged that Derek had a good smile. Adrian took the phone. She took 3 photos. Derek looked at all 3 and selected one, and I watched his thumbs move across the screen for approximately 4 minutes before he looked up and said, "Sorry, just wanted to get the caption right." I was standing in the far corner of the room, next to the small rolling table where Natalie kept her water cup and the lip balm Sylvia had brought her on day 2. I was not in the frame of any of the 3 photos. I knew this because I had not moved from that corner since Derek arrived, and the angle of the phone had been consistently toward the bed and the window. Natalie glanced at me once while Derek was typing. I gave her nothing to read in my face. That was a skill I had spent decades developing, and I was grateful for it now. Derek posted the photo at 2:31 p.m. I know because Natalie's phone, which was face up on the bed beside her, lit up with a notification at 2:34 3 minutes after posting, and then again at 2:37, and then in a pattern of increasing frequency that I stopped tracking after the 7th alert. The caption, which Natalie read aloud to no one in particular in a quiet voice, was "My whole world, worth every sleepless night." I counted the water stains on the ceiling tile above the window. There were 4. I had not counted them before. It was useful to have something to count. Dr. Margaret Holt came in at 3:05 to check the incision site. She was a precise woman, mid-50s, efficient in her movements, the kind of doctor who had learned that unnecessary words in a recovery room often did more harm than silence. She had been Natalie's OB for 3 years. She had been the one to call me on the night of the delivery to say that everything had gone as well as it could have, given the circumstances. I had stood in the hospital parking garage when she said that and looked at my hands for a long time after I hung up. She pulled the curtain partially around the bed to examine the incision. Derek stepped back and looked at his phone. Dr. Holt worked quietly. When she was finished, she made a note in the chart, then looked up. She looked at Derek once. Then she looked at me. Then she turned back to Natalie and said, "You're recovering very well. You have a good support system around you." She said it to Natalie, but her eyes had moved back to me by the time she finished the sentence. She did not elaborate. She closed the chart and left. Adrian came back in at 3:30 to check the incision dressing. She worked quietly, the way she always did, her attention on the task. Derek was standing near the window, looking at his phone. Natalie winced slightly as Adrian adjusted the bandage. Derek glanced over. He said, "It's not like it was an emergency." Right. The C-section was scheduled anyway. Adrian's hands stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then she continued. She did not look at Derek. She did not look at me. She looked at Natalie and said, in a voice that was entirely level, "You're healing well. The site looks good." She made her note in the chart and left the room without saying anything else. I had the notebook open in my lap. I wrote the sentence down exactly as he had said it. I wrote the time, 3:31, and I wrote Adrian's name beside it. Natalie was looking at the ceiling. Derek left at 3:47. He said he had a dinner meeting. Client thing. Can't reschedule. You know how it is. And he kissed Natalie's forehead again and touched Owen's head with 2 fingers. Very briefly. And then he was gone. He had been in the room for 93 minutes. In 93 minutes, he had not asked about the incision. He had not asked what Dr. Holt had said. He had not asked whether Natalie was sleeping through the night or whether the pain medication was still necessary or whether the nurse had shown her the correct way to position Owen for feeding, which Adrian had spent 40 minutes demonstrating on Tuesday because Natalie's arms were still weak from the surgery. Sylvia arrived at 4 o'clock, the same way she had arrived every afternoon since day 2 with a small container of something she had made at home, because she had decided early on that hospital food was an insult to recovery. Today it was lentil soup. She set it on the rolling table, looked at the empty chair where Derek had been sitting, and looked at me. He didn't ask about her incision once. She said, it was not a question. No, I said, he didn't. Sylvia had been a labor and delivery nurse for 28 years before she retired. She had seen the full range of what people did and didn't do in hospital rooms, and she had long ago stopped being surprised by any of it. But she pressed her lips together in a way that told me she had not quite reached the point of being unbothered by it either. She sat down next to Natalie and opened the soup container and did not say anything else about Derek. That was the right call. Natalie was tired, and the afternoon light was going, and Owen had finally settled into the particular quality of sleep that made the room feel like it was breathing slowly. I stayed until Natalie fell asleep around 9. I sat with Owen in the chair by the window, in the dark, with the city outside doing what cities do at night, the distant movement of traffic, the occasional siren pulling away and then fading. Owen was 6 days old and weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces and had his mother's ears and, I thought, his grandfather's habit of looking at things slightly longer than necessary before deciding what to make of them. I was not looking at my phone. I had left it face down on the rolling table, but at 9:47 it lit up, and I turned it over, and it was a notification Natalie's Instagram account had been tagged in Derek's post. I had not known until that moment that my daughter had an Instagram account, or that Derek had tagged her, or that the post had accumulated 214 likes and 37 comments. The first comment, posted 4 minutes after the original, was from an account called ConnieMar58. So proud of you. Son Owen is perfect. Love you all. I put the phone face down again. Owen made a small sound. I adjusted my arm slightly. He settled. I thought about the notebook in my pocket. I thought about the 48 hours I had said I needed. I thought about Priya Anand, who had texted me on day 3 to say that the preliminary review was complete, and that she had questions, and that whenever I was ready, she was ready. I had not yet told her I was ready. I was not yet ready. There was a difference between having enough and having all of it. And I had spent enough years in rooms where incomplete information led to incomplete outcomes to know that the difference mattered. The next morning, at 8:22, Natalie's phone buzzed on the bed beside her. She was awake. She had been awake since 7, when the morning shift nurse had come to check vitals, and Owen had decided that the activity warranted his full attention. I was in the chair. Natalie reached for the phone the way people reach for phones in hospitals, which is with a kind of reflexive hope that it will be something ordinary. She read the message. I watched her read it. I had spent a long time watching people read things, documents, letters, messages, and I had learned that the face tells you more in the first 4 seconds than in everything that comes after, because after 4 seconds, people begin to manage what they're showing. In the first 4 seconds, Natalie's expression moved through something I recognized but had not seen on her face since she was 19, and I had to tell her that her mother's cancer had come back. She read the message a second time, then she held the phone out to me without saying anything. The message was from Tamara Reyes. I knew the name. I had met her at the company holiday party the previous December, a woman in her early 30s with a direct manner, and I had thought at the time, good judgment. The message read, "Hey, just checking in. Derek mentioned you had the baby. Hope you're okay. Also, he told me he was in Louisville that weekend in October. I saw him at Meridian Bar with someone. I didn't want to say anything, but I think you should know." I read it once, then I read it again. October. Natalie had been 7 months pregnant in October. The last weekend of October, she had called me on a Saturday afternoon to say that Derek was out of town for a work conference in Louisville and that she was having trouble sleeping and could I come over. And I had driven 40 minutes and we had watched 2 episodes of a nature documentary and I had slept on the couch because she had asked me not to leave. I had not thought anything of it at the time except that my daughter was 7 months pregnant and alone and had called her father, and that seemed like a reasonable thing for a person to do. He told me he was in Louisville. I saw him at Meridian Bar with someone. I handed the phone back to Natalie. She was looking at the window. Outside, the morning was overcast, the kind of flat gray light that makes everything look like it is waiting for something. I said, "Don't respond yet." She didn't ask why. She had grown up watching me work. She knew what "don't respond yet" meant. I picked up my own phone and opened the notes I had been keeping since day one. I added 3 lines. Then I sent a single text to Priya Anand. "I'm ready." Natalie was still looking at the window. Owen was in the bassinet, asleep, one small fist pressed against his cheek. The wall clock stuttered on the 40-second mark. I counted the water stains on the ceiling tile again. Still 4. Some things stay the same no matter how much changes beneath them. Natalie came home on day 8. The discharge nurse, a woman named Keisha, who had been on the maternity floor for 14 years, walked her to the elevator herself. She didn't have to do that. She did it anyway. I carried Owen in the infant seat, and Natalie walked slowly beside me, one hand on my arm, and I matched her pace without thinking about it. That's the thing about being a father. You learn the pace of the person you're protecting without ever deciding to. The house smelled like the candles Sylvia had lit while we were gone. She had come in that morning with a casserole and a bunch of tulips from her garden and had left both on the kitchen counter with a note that said, simply, "Welcome home, little one." I put the note on the refrigerator. Natalie read it and didn't say anything. She sat down carefully on the couch and held Owen against her chest and looked at the window for a long time. Derek was not there. He had texted. I had seen the texts over Natalie's shoulder, not because I was looking, but because she held the phone at an angle that made it impossible not to see. "Glad you're home. Rest up. I'll be by soon." That was the whole message. No question about the incision. No question about whether she needed anything from the pharmacy. No question about Owen's weight at discharge, which was 7 pounds 2 ounces, and which the nurses had written on a little card with a footprint that Natalie kept in her coat pocket the entire ride home. Derek had not asked about the card. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table while Natalie rested. I had my notebook open, the small one, the kind I used to carry during field work. Narrow ruled, black cover. I had been keeping notes since the morning of day 1, in the hospital, when I first understood what kind of situation this was. Old habit. When you spend 22 years as an investigator, you stop trusting memory and start trusting documentation. Memory is edited by the person who holds it. Paper doesn't edit itself. I called Priya Anand that afternoon, from the back porch, while Natalie slept. Priya and I had worked together for 11 years before she moved from investigation support into family law. She was meticulous, unhurried, and she had a particular skill for finding the thing that someone believed was hidden. I had referred 3 cases to her in the past 4 years. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I knew. I told her about the night of the birth, the call at 2:07 in the morning, the words Derek had used, the 40-minute drive I had made while he stayed in bed. I told her about the 5 days at the hospital, about the texts Natalie had received that were polite and hollow and never once asked the right question. I told her about Sylvia's account of what she had heard Derek say on the phone. I told her about the screenshot from Tamara Reyes, the message sent to Natalie 2 days ago, which Natalie had shown me that morning in the hospital room, which I had photographed with my own phone before she put it away. I read Priya the relevant portion from my notes. I did not editorialize. I gave her the facts in sequence, the way I had always given her facts. When I finished, Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need 48 hours. I said, "I know." She said, "Ray, is Natalie aware of the full scope of what you're describing?" I said, "She's aware of enough." Priya said she would call me Thursday morning. I went back inside and washed the 2 mugs in the sink and checked on Owen in the bassinet. He was asleep. His breathing was steady and small. I watched him for a moment, then went to make dinner. Connie Marsh called on Thursday evening. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that was 9 minutes long. I listened to it twice, taking notes. The summary was there had been a misunderstanding. Derek was under enormous pressure. The family needed to come together, and she wanted to organize a gathering at Natalie's house on Saturday to talk things through calmly. She used the phrase, "clear the air," 4 times. She did not once mention Owen by name. I played the voicemail for Natalie. Natalie listened with her eyes on the window. When it ended, she said, "She's going to take his side." I said, "Yes." She said, "Should I let them come?" Priya had called that morning. As promised, she had what she needed. I had already told Natalie that Saturday would be fine. I said, "Let them come." Sylvia arrived at 9 on Saturday morning to help with Owen. She came through the back door the way she always did, set her bag down, washed her hands, and picked him up from the bassinet without being asked. She had been a maternity nurse for 31 years before she retired. She held Owen with the particular ease of someone for whom a newborn is not a fragile thing, but a familiar one. Natalie watched her, and something in her shoulders came down slightly. I had set the kitchen table with 5 chairs. I had put the folder on the counter, under my jacket. I had not told Derek that Priya would be there. Connie had not asked who else would be attending, and I had not volunteered the information. Priya arrived at 10. She set her briefcase on the floor beside the chair I had placed at the end of the table, and she accepted the coffee I offered her. And she did not say much. She had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she set both on the table without opening the briefcase yet. She looked the way she always looked before a meeting of this kind, attentive and entirely still. Derek and Connie arrived at 10:15. Derek was wearing a collared shirt, pressed. He looked rested. He looked, I thought, like a man who had rehearsed something and was ready to deliver it. He saw Priya and his step slowed, just briefly, before he recovered. He said, "I didn't know we were bringing lawyers." Priya said, "I'm here as a family friend." Connie said, of course," and set a bakery box on the counter that no one opened. Behind them, 2 more people came through the door. I had not met them before, but I recognized the family resemblance immediately. Derek's older sister, a woman named Gail, who lived in Covington, and whom Natalie had mentioned twice in passing, and beside her, a man I took to be Gail's husband. Connie had not mentioned she was bringing them. I suspected she had invited them as reinforcement witnesses to what she had expected would be a reconciliation. People who could later confirm that she had tried, that the family had come together, that it had gone well. She had not told them what the meeting was actually about. I could see that in the way Gail looked around the kitchen with the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a gathering and is still determining its nature. I set 2 more chairs at the table without comment. We sat down. Sylvia stayed in the doorway to the living room with Owen, close enough to hear, her attention on the baby, but her head angled toward the table. Derek began. He was prepared, as I had expected him to be. He spoke about the presentation, a regional logistics review that his director had moved up without notice, the kind of thing that happens in his industry, the kind of pressure that people outside corporate environments don't always understand. He spoke about the weeks before the birth, the travel, the client demands, the way work had compressed everything. He said he had handled the situation the best way he could, given the circumstances. He used the word "I" 14 times in 4 minutes. I counted. Old habit. Connie nodded throughout. She made small sounds of agreement. When Derek finished, he looked at Natalie. Then he looked at me. He seemed to be waiting for a response. I reached under my jacket on the counter and I placed the folder on the table. I said, "Take a look." Inside the folder was a printed summary of the joint credit card statements for the past 4 months. I had organized it clearly: date, merchant, amount, category. The total at the bottom of the first page was $11,400. I had highlighted 3 sets of transactions, 3 separate weekends, the most recent being in October, the others in August and September. Each set included a restaurant charge, a hotel charge, and in 2 cases, a retail purchase from a jewelry store in the East Market District. The October weekend was the one Derek had described to Natalie as a trip to Louisville for a client meeting. Derek looked at the page. He said, without hesitating, "Those are client entertainment expenses. I've told Natalie about the travel requirements." I placed the second document on top of the first. Priya said, "Mr. Marsh," she said it the way she said everything, without inflection, without hurry. "What you're looking at is a compilation of documented expenditures from a joint marital account during a period in which your wife was undergoing high-risk prenatal care. The hotel records, which I obtained through a formal records request on Thursday, show single occupancy bookings registered under your name at a property in this city. not in Louisville. The October check-in was Friday the 14th. Your wife's records show she was admitted for monitoring that same weekend. She slid the hotel documentation across the table. Derek did not pick it up. Connie had stopped nodding. Priya continued. Additionally, a communication received by your wife on the morning of day 7 at the hospital establishes a pattern of personal conduct that is inconsistent with the characterization you've just offered. She turned a page on her legal pad. The message was sent by Tamara Reyes. It reads, in relevant part, he told me he was in Louisville. I saw him at Meridian Bar with someone. Derek's expression did not collapse. It did something more specific than that it reorganized. The name had landed somewhere, and I watched him calculate, in the space of approximately 2 seconds, what Tamara Reyes, knowing what she knew, meant for the version of events he had just delivered. Gail, sitting 2 chairs down, looked at her brother. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they thought they knew when a door opens onto a room they didn't know existed. Connie had gone very still. Priya did not pause. The message was corroborated by a second source. Under state statute, the deliberate use of marital assets for personal purposes of this nature during a documented period of medical need is a factor that courts weigh significantly in asset division proceedings. Derek said, "This is not the place for this." Priya said, "You're right that it isn't. That's why I've also prepared the initial petition." She opened the briefcase and placed a bound document on the table. It was not thick. It didn't need to be. Derek looked at Natalie. His voice changed, the rehearsed tone dropped, and what came through instead was something more urgent. He said, "You can't do this. We have a son. You're not thinking clearly. You just had surgery. You're not—" Natalie said, "You said you needed your sleep." The room went quiet in a specific way, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had been said and could not be unsaid. It was not a long sentence. It didn't require explanation. 6 words. And every person in that room knew exactly what they meant, and exactly when they had been said, and exactly what had been happening on the other end of the phone while she was saying them. Sylvia, standing in the doorway with Owen against her shoulder, looked up. She looked at Natalie, then she looked at me. Her expression did not change, but she shifted Owen slightly and turned her body so that she was fully facing the room. Derek said, "That's not fair." No one responded to that. Connie said, quietly, "Derek, just his name, nothing else." I had known, from the moment she organized this meeting, that she believed she was coming here to manage a situation. I watched her look at the hotel documentation on the table. She had not touched it, but she had read enough of it from where she sat, and I watched something shift in her face. Not guilt, exactly. More like the particular expression of a person who has just understood that the story they were told and the story that happened are not the same story. Priya said, "Mr. Marsh, I'd recommend you contact your own counsel before responding further. The petition has been filed as of this morning. You'll receive formal notification at your registered address within the week." She capped her pen. She picked up her legal pad. She had written 3 lines on it the entire meeting. Derek stood up. He looked at the folder, at the bound document, at Natalie, at me. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I drove to the hospital at 2 in the morning." He didn't say anything after that. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked to the front door and opened it and went through it without looking back. Connie stayed seated for a moment. She looked at Natalie. She started to say something, and then did not. She picked up her purse and followed her son out. The front door closed. Priya gathered her documents and returned them to the briefcase. She said to Natalie, "Call me Monday. We'll go through the next steps at whatever pace works for you." Natalie nodded. Priya picked up the briefcase and said goodbye to Sylvia on her way out. Sylvia walked to the table and sat down in the chair Connie had vacated. Owen was awake now, his eyes open and unfocused the way newborns' eyes are, taking in light without making sense of it yet. Sylvia looked at Natalie and said, "Do you want tea?" Natalie said yes. I left the folder on the table. The bakery box was still on the counter. I picked up the 2 coffee cups that hadn't been touched and set them in the sink. Derek signed 3 weeks later. Priya had called me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me. I was in my car, parked outside a hardware store, and I sat there for a moment after she said it. She gave me the details the way she always gave details, precise, in order, without editorial. The $11,400 in unauthorized charges had been folded into the asset division. The house would stay in Natalie's name. Derek would have supervised visitation until the court reviewed the full record, which Priya had made sure was substantial. She said he hadn't pushed back on a single line. I asked if he'd had his own attorney present. She said yes, a man named Garrett from a mid-level firm downtown, and that Garrett had advised Derek to sign without modification. I thanked her. She said, "That's what we prepared for." I told her I knew. I drove home on the same route I'd been driving for 30 years. I didn't stop for anything. The divorce itself took 11 weeks from filing to finalization, faster than average, because there was nothing to contest. Derek had no claim on the house, which had been purchased with a down payment from my wife's estate before the marriage and had never been retitled. He had no claim on Natalie's pension, which was structured through the school district in a way that predated their relationship by 4 years. What he had was his salary, his car, a storage unit he'd been renting since month 2 of the marriage without telling Natalie, and whatever was left in the joint account after Priya's accounting was complete. Priya told me the storage unit detail as a footnote. I didn't ask what was in it. Some things you don't need to know to understand the shape of what happened. Connie Marsh called me 2 weeks after the meeting at Natalie's house. It was a Sunday evening, just past 7. I recognized the number because I'd written it down the night Natalie first introduced Derek to me. 6 years ago, old habit, from the years when writing down numbers was the difference between closing a case and losing a thread. I let it ring twice before I answered. She said, "I didn't know." Her voice was careful, the way a person's voice gets when they've rehearsed a sentence many times and are still not sure it will land. I believed her, not because she deserved the benefit of the doubt in particular, but because I'd watched her face in that living room when Priya read the timestamps, and the expression I'd seen was not guilt. It was the specific look of someone realizing they had been used as a prop in a story they didn't know they were part of. I said, "I believe you." She started to say something else. I said, "Take care of yourself, Connie." Then I ended the call. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and finished washing the bowl I'd been rinsing when it rang. That was the last time we spoke. 6 weeks after the finalization, Natalie told me that Connie had called her. Not me, Natalie, directly. She had called on a Tuesday evening, and Natalie had answered because Owen was fussing and she'd picked up without looking at the screen. The call lasted 11 minutes. Natalie gave me the summary afterward. Sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, Connie had said she was sorry. Not for anything specific. Connie was not a woman built for specific apologies, but in the general way of someone who has looked at a situation from a new angle and found it worse than she expected. She had said she wanted to keep seeing Owen. She had said she hoped Natalie would allow it. She had not mentioned Derek once in 11 minutes. Natalie had said yes. She told me she'd said yes because Owen deserved a grandmother and because Connie, whatever else she was, had not been the one who stayed in bed. I thought that was the right call. I told her so. The other thing I learned from Priya, as a footnote to a longer conversation about the finalization paperwork. Tamara Reyes, she mentioned, had stopped seeing Derek in November, apparently shortly after the message she'd sent Natalie, when the details of the hospital week had circulated in the way details circulate in a small professional network. Priya said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. I wrote it in the notebook and then closed it. I had not opened that particular notebook since. Natalie and Owen stayed in the house. Derek was out by the end of the first week. He'd apparently been staying at a friend's place since the night of the meeting, which told me he'd known the meeting wasn't going to go the way his mother had planned it. He collected the rest of his things on a Saturday when Natalie was at her sister-in-law's. He left his key on the kitchen counter. Natalie texted me a photo of it. I didn't respond right away. There wasn't anything to say. Sylvia came every Tuesday. She had been doing it since the week after Natalie came home from the hospital, and she kept doing it after the divorce was filed and after it was finalized and after the season changed. She brought soup, usually something she'd made the day before, in a container she'd labeled with the date in black marker. She would sit with Owen while Natalie slept, or showered, or simply sat in a different room without a baby in her arms for 40 minutes. I asked Sylvia once if it was too much. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Raymond, I was a labor and delivery nurse for 26 years. Sitting with a sleeping infant is not too much." I didn't ask again. I came on weekends. I drove the 40 minutes on Saturday mornings and sometimes stayed through Sunday. I learned which drawer Natalie kept the extra burp cloths in. I learned that Owen preferred being held slightly upright rather than cradled flat, and that he would fuss for exactly 3 minutes before settling if you kept moving. I learned the specific way to fold the portable bassinet so the latch caught on the first try instead of the third. These are not things I would have known how to learn at 30. At 63, I understood that learning them was the point. 3 months after Owen was born, I was sitting on Natalie's front porch on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. Owen was asleep against my chest. His weight distributed the way sleeping infants distribute their weight completely, without reservation. Natalie came out with 2 cups of coffee. She sat in the chair beside me, pulled her knees up, and we were quiet for a while. The street was calm. A neighbor 2 doors down was raking the last of the winter debris from her yard. The coffee was good. Natalie had started buying better beans since Derek left, a small change she'd mentioned once without elaborating. She said, "He posted new photos on Instagram." I didn't ask what they were of. I didn't ask where they were taken, or who had taken them, or whether he was smiling in the way he smiled when he wanted people to think he was doing well. I had spent 30 years of my professional life understanding that information is only useful when it changes what you do next. That information changed nothing. I drank my coffee. Natalie looked out at the street. After a moment, she said, "Owen's getting heavy." I said, "He is." She said, "You don't have to hold him the whole time." I said, "I know." She smiled, not the careful smile she'd been wearing for weeks after coming home from the hospital, the one that meant she was managing, holding herself at a slight remove from her own life while she figured out what it was going to look like. This was something else, smaller, more private, the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. Owen shifted against my chest without waking. I adjusted my arm. There's a thing that happens in the 8th week with newborns. The research on it is consistent, and I'd read some of it in the weeks after Owen was born because reading is what I do when I'm waiting for something to resolve. By the 8th week, an infant's auditory processing has developed enough that they begin to recognize individual voices, not just the pattern of sound, but the specific frequency and rhythm of the people who have been present. They turn toward it, not always, not on command, but enough that you notice. Owen started recognizing my voice in week 8. I'd been talking to him the way you talk to someone who can't respond yet, but is listening about nothing in particular, about the weather and the hardware store and the drive over, about what his mother had been like when she was small and brought home a box turtle she'd found in the park and named it Gerald and kept it for a week before I explained that Gerald probably had a family of his own to get back to. The first time Owen turned his head toward my voice, I was sitting in the rocking chair in the corner of his room, talking about nothing, and he turned, slowly and without urgency, in the direction of the sound. I stopped talking. He turned a little more, searching. I don't know if Derek knows that. I don't know what Derek knows about week 8, or about the specific weight of a sleeping infant, or about what it means to be the person a child turns toward when they hear a sound they recognize as safe. I didn't ask. I had no reason to.